What happens when a calm, thoughtful movie star walks into one of television's most opinionated talk shows, and a routine interview suddenly turns into something nobody in the studio expected? The lights inside the studio of The View glowed intensely that morning, reflecting off the polished table where the host sat waiting. The audience buzzed with quiet excitement, their whispers filling the room as producers signaled that the show was about to return from commercial. This was supposed to be a simple promotional interview, but sometimes television has other plans. Before we dive into this unbelievable moment, make sure to subscribe to Live Narratives, like the video, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Trust us, this story gets intense. The applause sign lit up. Clapping erupted across the studio as the announcer's voice echoed warmly through the room. Please welcome Timothée Chalamet. The curtain parted, and Timothée stepped out with his usual quiet confidence. Dressed in a sleek black jacket and simple white shirt, he gave a modest wave to the cheering crowd. His signature smile appeared briefly, polite, almost shy. He had been on talk shows many times before, but this time would feel different. The hosts greeted him with practiced warmth as he took his seat at the long table. Joy Behar leaned slightly forward, smiling in that unmistakable way viewers had come to recognize over decades of television. "Timothy, welcome back," she said, her tone playful. "You're becoming a regular around here." The audience laughed softly. Timothy chuckled, nodding politely. "I appreciate that. It's always nice to be invited." At first, everything felt perfectly normal. The conversation began with the usual topics: his latest film, the challenges of filming on location, the long hours, the creative process. Timothy spoke thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully, the way he often did in interviews. He described the emotional depth of the role, the preparation it required, and the collaboration with the director. The audience listened closely. Joy nodded, occasionally raising an eyebrow or adding a quick joke that made the crowd laugh. But then something shifted. It started subtly. Joy leaned back in her chair and tilted her head slightly, studying him with curiosity. "You've become a very serious actor," she said. "A lot of intense roles. Heavy themes." Timothy smiled politely. "I guess I'm drawn to stories that explore complicated people." Joy tapped her fingers lightly on the desk. "Complicated is one word," she replied. "But some people say your films are a little gloomy." A few audience members chuckled nervously. Timothy didn't seem bothered. "Stories reflect real life," he said calmly. "And life isn't always simple." The room quieted slightly. The other hosts watched the exchange carefully. Joy leaned forward again, her voice playful, but edged with something sharper. "But do you ever worry that Hollywood is getting a little too serious? Like everyone wants to be profound all the time?" Timothy paused for a moment. It was the kind of question that sounded casual but carried a subtle challenge underneath. He answered thoughtfully. "I think audiences appreciate honesty," he said. "If a story means something, people connect with it." The audience applauded lightly. Joy smiled, but her eyes stayed focused on him. "And yet," she continued, "some critics say actors today are a little overly sensitive, always talking about feelings, struggles, identity." The air in the studio shifted again. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Timothy folded his hands calmly on the table. "I think storytelling has always been about feelings," he said. Joy tilted her head. "Yes, but sometimes it feels like celebrities want to lecture everyone." A murmur rippled through the audience. One of the other hosts shifted slightly in her seat. Timothy's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened just a little. "I try not to lecture," he said. "I just talk about my experiences." Joy smiled again, but this time it felt different. "Well," she said lightly, "actors often think their experiences are very important." A few gasps echoed softly from the audience. The moment lingered in the air. Timothy blinked once, clearly recognizing that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Still, he remained calm. "I think everyone's experiences matter," he replied. The audience applauded again. Joy chuckled. "Oh, that's a very diplomatic answer." The tension was building now, slowly, quietly. Producers offstage exchanged quick glances. This was no longer just small talk. Joy crossed her arms slightly. Some people say Hollywood stars like to tell the public how to think, she continued. Politics, social issues, all of it. The studio grew noticeably quieter. Timothée leaned back slightly in his chair, taking a breath. Then he answered in a calm, measured voice. I don't think sharing an opinion means telling people what to think. Joy raised an eyebrow. But celebrities do have a lot of influence. That's true, Timothée admitted. So shouldn't actors stick to acting? The audience reacted immediately, some clapping, some murmuring, others shifting in their seats. The atmosphere had officially changed. Timothée looked directly at Joy now. His tone remained respectful, but there was a firmness in it that hadn't been there before. Artists have always spoken about the world around them, he said. Joy smiled again, but the smile felt more like a challenge. Well, we'll see about that. A quiet ripple of tension moved through the studio. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This interview was beginning to go somewhere unexpected. The other hosts tried to lighten the mood, tossing in a quick joke about filming locations and long movie shoots. The audience laughed again, but the tension hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. Joy leaned back in her chair again, watching Timothée carefully, almost studying him. Then she said something that made several audience members glance at each other. She began slowly. Young actors today seem very confident about their ideas. Timothée nodded. Joy continued. But confidence can sometimes look like arrogance. The room froze for a split second. Timothée blinked again, clearly surprised by the direction of the comment. Yet he didn't raise his voice. He simply smiled faintly. I think it depends on how you define confidence. A few audience members applauded. Joy laughed softly. Oh, we're going to have a conversation today. The crowd reacted with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. They could feel it now. Something was brewing, the kind of moment that television producers secretly hoped for. Timothée leaned slightly forward. His calm demeanor remained intact, but his answers were becoming more direct. And Joy Behar looked more than ready to keep pushing. Neither of them knew it yet, but the next question would ignite a conversation that would spread far beyond the walls of the studio and leave the entire audience stunned. The moment lingered like electricity in the air. You could feel it moving through the studio, quiet, tense, unpredictable. Timothée Chalamet sat calmly at the table, his posture relaxed but alert now, like someone who had just realized a casual conversation had turned into something far more serious. Across from him, Joy Behar watched him closely, her expression half smile, half challenge. The audience sensed it too. That strange feeling when an interview stops being scripted television and starts becoming real. Joy tapped her pen lightly against the table, the soft sound echoing faintly through the studio microphones. So, she said casually, you're part of a new generation of actors who speak very openly about social issues. Timothée nodded slowly. I think a lot of artists today feel connected to the world around them. Joy tilted her head. But sometimes it sounds less like connection and more like preaching. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The other hosts glanced at each other. Timothée didn't immediately respond. Instead, he paused for a moment, clearly thinking about how to answer without escalating the tension that was already starting to build. I don't see it as preaching, he said finally. I see it as participating. Joy leaned forward. Participating in what? In conversations that affect people's lives. The audience murmured quietly. Joy chuckled. But you're an actor. A few scattered laughs followed. Timothée smiled politely again, but this time his eyes carried a little more focus. Yes, he said calmly, but actors are also citizens. A light wave of applause rolled through the studio. Joy raised her eyebrows. Well, that's one way to look at it. One of the other hosts tried to shift the tone. Let's talk about your new film, she said quickly, smiling. You play a very complex character, someone struggling with identity and pressure. What was that like? The tension eased slightly as Timothée began describing the emotional challenges of the role. He spoke about long nights on set, about digging into the psychology of the character, about wanting to tell stories that reflected real human experiences. The audience listened closely. For a moment, it seemed like the interview might return to safe territory. But Joy wasn't finished. She waited patiently until the conversation slowed. Then she leaned back toward the microphone again. You know, she said thoughtfully, your character sounds like someone dealing with a lot of internal conflict. Timothy nodded. That's what drew me to the role. Joy folded her arms. And yet, when actors talk about struggles, sometimes regular people feel like you're comparing movie set problems to real-life ones. The room went quiet again. Timothy blinked. That's not my intention. But it happens, Joy replied. A few audience members shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed slightly closer now. This was no longer just an interview. It was turning into a debate. Timothy kept his tone measured. I think storytelling helps people understand each other, he said. It's not about comparing struggles. Joy smiled faintly. Some people might disagree. The audience murmured again. Timothy took a breath. And that's okay, he said calmly. People should disagree. That answer seemed to surprise Joy for a moment. She studied him again, almost like she was reassessing her approach. Then she asked the question that made several producers glance nervously toward each other behind the cameras. Do you think actors understand everyday life? The studio became very still. Timothy's eyes flickered briefly toward the audience before returning to Joy. I try to, he said honestly. Joy leaned closer. But you grew up around the arts, right? Film sets, creative circles, not exactly the same world most people live in. There it was. The tension had officially crossed into something personal. Timothy shifted slightly in his chair. That's true, he admitted. But empathy doesn't require the same background. The audience applauded again, louder this time. Joy laughed softly. You're very good at answering questions. Timothy smiled. I've had practice. The crowd chuckled, but the tension still lingered. Joy rested her chin on her hand for a moment before speaking again. Let me ask you something honestly, she said. Do actors ever worry they're becoming out of touch? The question hung in the air. Even the audience seemed unsure how to react. Timothy looked thoughtful again. I think anyone can become out of touch, he replied slowly. Not just actors. Joy nodded. That's fair. Then she added quietly, but Hollywood has a reputation for living in a bubble. The studio reacted with scattered applause and murmurs. Timothy remained calm. Sometimes, he said, but the industry is made up of thousands of people from different backgrounds. Joy raised an eyebrow. Still, you're part of a very powerful system. Timothy leaned forward slightly now. I'm part of a storytelling industry. Joy smiled again. And storytelling can shape opinions. The audience reacted with another wave of murmurs. Timothy didn't deny it. That's true. Joy nodded slowly. So when actors speak publicly, they know millions of people are listening. Yes. And that influence carries responsibility. Timothy met her gaze directly. I agree. The audience applauded again. For a moment, the conversation felt balanced again. But Joy wasn't done testing him. You seem very thoughtful, she said. But some critics say your generation of actors can be overly sensitive. A few audience members groaned quietly. Timothy raised his eyebrows slightly. In what way? Joy shrugged. Everything becomes a big emotional discussion. The tension returned instantly. Timothy considered the comment carefully. Then he said something that made the entire studio go quiet again. I think caring about things isn't a weakness. A ripple of applause rolled through the audience. Joy smiled, but there was a flicker of surprise in her expression now. Timothy continued calmly. If people talk about emotions more openly today, that might actually be progress. The crowd clapped louder this time. Joy laughed softly. Well, now you're giving a speech. Timothy shook his head slightly. No, he said. Just sharing a perspective. The audience seemed firmly on his side now, but the tension between the two remained. Joy leaned back again, crossing her arms thoughtfully. All right, she said slowly. You've handled every question very calmly. Timothy smiled. I'm trying. Joy looked directly at him. Let's see how you handle the next one. The crowd leaned forward slightly. Even the other hosts seemed unsure where this was going. Joy paused dramatically before speaking again. Then she asked a question that made the entire studio inhale sharply. Do you think Hollywood actors sometimes take themselves too seriously? The The room fell into complete silence. Timothy blinked. For the first time since the interview began, he hesitated. And that hesitation was all Joy needed to push the conversation somewhere nobody in the audience expected. For the first time since the interview began, Timothée Chalamet didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched across the studio like a tightening wire. The audience leaned forward in their seats. Some people glanced at each other, sensing that the conversation had reached a turning point. Joy Behar watched him carefully, her expression calm but unmistakably provocative. Do you think Hollywood actors sometimes take themselves too seriously? It sounded like a simple question, but the way she asked it made it feel like a challenge. Timothy exhaled slowly, folding his hands together on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was something firmer underneath it now. I think any profession can take itself too seriously. A few audience members clapped quietly. Joy smiled, though the smile didn't fully reach her eyes. That's a diplomatic answer. Timothy tilted his head slightly. It's an honest one. The crowd murmured again. The other hosts shifted subtly in their seats, sensing that the interview had moved into unfamiliar territory. Joy leaned forward. But let's be real, she said. Actors walk red carpets, attend award shows, get paid millions, and then talk about how difficult their lives are. A ripple of reactions spread through the audience. Some laughter, some uncomfortable silence. Timothy nodded slowly. I understand why that perception exists. Joy's eyebrow lifted. So, you admit it? I admit that people see things differently, he replied. The audience applauded again. Joy tapped her pen on the table. But perception usually comes from somewhere. Timothy met her gaze again. Yes, he said calmly. And sometimes perception comes from headlines rather than reality. The audience reacted instantly, with louder applause. Joy laughed softly. Oh, you're pushing back now. Timothy smiled faintly. I'm just explaining my perspective. But the tone of the conversation had changed. What started as a promotional interview had turned into a quiet standoff. Joy leaned back again, studying him. You know what I think, she said. The audience fell silent again. I think young actors today believe their voices are just as important as people who've spent decades studying politics, economics, history. A few murmurs of agreement came from somewhere in the crowd. Timothy listened carefully. Then he answered with a calmness that seemed almost deliberate. I don't think actors replace experts. Joy tilted her head. But you still speak publicly about serious issues. Yes. And millions of fans listen. Timothy nodded. That's true. Joy leaned forward again. So, why should people take political or social advice from movie stars? The question landed like a stone in still water. Timothy paused again, but this time his hesitation wasn't uncertainty. It was restraint. I don't think anyone should blindly follow celebrities, he said. The audience seemed surprised by the answer. Joy blinked. You don't. No, Timothy continued. People should listen to many voices. Experts, journalists, teachers, and yes, artists too. A wave of applause erupted through the studio. Joy chuckled. That's very balanced. Timothy smiled slightly. I try. The crowd laughed lightly, but the tension hadn't disappeared. If anything, it was growing sharper. Joy crossed her arms. But let's talk about influence, she continued. Your fans hang on every word you say. Timothy shook his head gently. I don't expect them to. Joy smirked. Come on. You're one of the biggest stars of your generation. A few audience members cheered. Timothy shrugged modestly. That doesn't mean people should treat my opinions as facts. The audience applauded again, this time louder than before. Joy leaned closer to the table. Well, that's refreshing, she admitted. Then her tone shifted again. But you do realize something, right? Timothy looked at her. What's that? Joy spoke slowly now. When celebrities step into serious discussions, they open themselves to criticism. Timothy nodded immediately. I agree. Joy looked slightly surprised by how quickly he answered. You do? Yes, he said simply. Public conversation should include criticism. The audience applauded again. Joy laughed. You're very calm under pressure. Timothy smiled. I'm not sure it's pressure. That line made the crowd react with a mixture of laughter and applause. Joy raised both eyebrows now. Oh, really? Timothée leaned slightly forward, his voice still composed. We're just talking. But the atmosphere didn't feel casual anymore. The studio lights suddenly felt brighter. The air felt heavier. Joy tapped her fingers on the table again. You know what's interesting? She said. What? You're incredibly polite, but you're also disagreeing with almost everything I'm saying. The audience laughed. Timothée chuckled softly. That's not my goal. Joy pointed at him playfully. But it's happening. The crowd laughed again. For a moment, the tension softened. But then Joy asked something that instantly changed the energy again. Let me ask you something personal, she said. Timothée nodded cautiously. Sure. Joy's voice became more direct now. Do you think fame has changed you? The question caught him slightly off guard. He thought about it carefully. I hope not, he said. Joy tilted her head. But it must. In some ways, he admitted. The audience listened closely. Joy continued. You're surrounded by attention, wealth, success that affects people. Timothée nodded again. It can. Joy leaned closer. So, how do you stay grounded? For a moment, the tension eased as Timothée began speaking about his family, his friends, and the people who kept him connected to reality. He spoke about growing up in a creative but modest environment and how his parents always encouraged humility. The audience listened warmly. Some even applauded. But Joy wasn't finished. After he finished speaking, she paused thoughtfully. Then she said something that made the entire room freeze again. Well, humility is good. Timothée nodded politely. But sometimes, Joy continued slowly, actors talk about humility while living lives most people can't even imagine. A few audience members gasped. The cameras zoomed closer. Timothée blinked. The conversation had just crossed into its most uncomfortable territory yet. He looked directly at Joy now. Still calm. Still respectful. But there was a clear intensity in his voice when he finally responded. I've never claimed my life is harder than anyone else's. The audience burst into applause. Joy opened her mouth slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct reply. Timothée continued quietly. But I do believe stories matter, and the people who tell them should care about the world they're part of. The applause grew louder. Joy leaned back in her chair slowly. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed slightly taken aback. The audience could feel it. The balance of the conversation had shifted. And the next exchange would determine whether this interview calmed down or exploded into the kind of television moment people would talk about for years. For a brief moment, the studio felt suspended in time. The applause slowly faded, but the tension it left behind lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Timothée Chalamet sat calmly at the table, his hands folded again, his expression composed but focused. Across from him, Joy Behar leaned back in her chair. For the first time since the interview began, she seemed to be reconsidering her next move. The audience could feel it. This was no longer a light celebrity interview. It had turned into something far more unpredictable. Joy cleared her throat slightly and glanced toward the other hosts before returning her attention to Timothée. Well, she said with a half smile, you certainly came prepared today. A ripple of laughter passed through the audience. Timothée smiled politely. I didn't know there was a test. More laughter. The moment eased slightly, but the underlying tension remained. Joy tapped her pen against the desk again. You've handled every question very carefully, she said. Timothée shrugged lightly. I just try to answer honestly. Joy tilted her head. But honesty can sometimes create controversy. The audience murmured again. Timothée nodded. That's true. Joy leaned forward slightly. And yet you seem comfortable stepping into serious conversations. I think conversations are healthy, Timothée replied. Joy gave a small chuckle. Yes, but not everyone agrees on what those conversations should look like. Timothée didn't immediately answer this time. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the audience, almost as if acknowledging the energy in the room. Then he spoke quietly. I think listening is just as important as speaking. The audience responded with another round of applause. Joy smiled, though her eyes still held that sharp curiosity. You know what I find fascinating? She said. What's that?
Timothy asked.
Joy leaned forward again, resting her elbows on the table. You're one of the most famous young actors in the world, yet you talk like someone who wants to avoid conflict. The audience reacted with soft laughter. Timothy smiled slightly. I don't enjoy conflict. Joy raised an eyebrow. Then you picked an interesting industry. More laughter rippled through the room. Timothy nodded. That's fair. The tension softened for a moment as the conversation drifted toward lighter topics. One of the other hosts asked about the challenges of filming overseas, and Timothy described long shooting days, unpredictable weather, and the pressure of delivering emotional performances. The audience listened attentively again. For a moment, it seemed like the dramatic edge of the conversation might finally fade. But Joy had one more thought she clearly wanted to explore. As the conversation paused, she leaned toward the microphone again. You know, she said slowly, there's something interesting about fame. Timothy looked at her. What do you mean? Joy tapped the table lightly. Fame amplifies everything. The audience grew quiet again, the good and the bad. Timothy nodded thoughtfully. That's probably true. Joy continued. When someone famous speaks, it becomes news.
Headlines.
Social media debates. Timothy agreed. That's the world we live in now. Joy looked directly at him again. And sometimes celebrities don't realize how powerful that microphone really is. The studio atmosphere tightened again. Timothy answered calmly. I think many of us are aware of that responsibility. Joy tilted her head slightly. But awareness doesn't always stop people from saying controversial things. Timothy paused. That's part of public conversation. Joy smiled faintly. And sometimes the public pushes back. The audience murmured.
Timothy nodded.
And that's their right. Joy watched him carefully again. You're very comfortable with disagreement. Timothy thought about that for a moment. I think disagreement is part of democracy. That line triggered one of the loudest rounds of applause so far. Some audience members even stood briefly before sitting back down. Joy blinked in mild surprise at the reaction. Well, she said with a laugh, you've got the crowd on your side today. Timothy smiled. I think they're just enjoying the conversation. Joy leaned back in her chair again, crossing her arms thoughtfully. You know what? She said. What? You're much tougher in interviews than people might expect. The audience laughed. Timothy raised his eyebrows. I'm not trying to be tough. Joy smirked. But you are pushing back. Timothy nodded calmly. When I disagree, yes. Joy chuckled. Well, television audiences love a good debate. The crowd clapped again. One of the other hosts jumped in quickly, sensing the growing intensity. I actually think this is refreshing, she said. We rarely get guests who engage this deeply. The audience applauded again. Timothy smiled gratefully. I appreciate that. Joy glanced at the studio clock briefly. They were approaching the end of the segment, but she clearly had one last question, and the tone of her voice changed when she asked it. All right, she said slowly. Let's end with something simple. Timothy nodded. Okay. Joy leaned closer. If a young fan watching this interview asked you one question, the studio fell silent again. What would you want them to ask? Timothy blinked, clearly surprised by the direction of the question. He thought about it carefully. The audience waited. The cameras zoomed in slightly. Finally, he answered. I'd want them to ask how to stay curious about the world. The crowd applauded warmly. Joy tilted her head. That's an interesting answer. Timothy continued. Because curiosity leads to empathy, and empathy helps people understand each other. More applause filled the studio. Joy nodded slowly. That's a very thoughtful response. Then she added something quietly that caught the entire room off guard. But curiosity can also lead to criticism. The audience murmured again. Timothy nodded calmly. And that's okay. Joy leaned back again, studying him with a thoughtful expression. Well, she said slowly, this has certainly been one of our more spirited interviews. The audience laughed. Timothy chuckled too. I didn't expect it to go this way. Joy smiled. Neither did we. The crowd applauded again. But behind the applause, something else was already beginning to happen. Backstage producers were whispering to each other. Clips of the exchange were already being marked for highlight segments. And somewhere beyond the studio walls, the internet was about to discover what had just happened. Within hours, this conversation would spread across social media, news outlets, and entertainment channels everywhere. And the reactions would be far more explosive than anyone in the studio could have imagined. The moment the cameras stopped rolling inside the studio of The View, something unusual happened. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The lights were still blazing overhead, the audience still seated, the host still at the table. But the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something quieter, almost reflective. Across the table, Sunny Hostin rested her hands on the desk, glancing toward Henry Cavill. The conversation they had just finished wasn't a typical celebrity segment. It hadn't been promotional. It hadn't been playful. It had been real. And everyone in that room knew it. Some audience members began clapping again, this time not as part of the show, but as a spontaneous reaction. The applause grew stronger, echoing across the studio. Henry stood up first, offering a polite nod to the crowd. "Thank you," he said warmly. Sunny rose as well, giving him a respectful smile. "Thank you for being open to the discussion," she said. Henry shook her hand. "Thank you for having the conversation." The exchange was calm, even cordial. But outside the studio walls, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Because during the live broadcast, clips from the debate had started appearing online. Within minutes, social media platforms were flooding with reactions. Short videos showing the moment Sunny said the word privilege. Clips of Henry responding calmly about humility. Segments where the audience erupted in applause. Every angle of the conversation was being dissected. On one side, some viewers praised Sunny for asking difficult questions. "She held him accountable," one commenter wrote. On the other side, many praised Henry for his composure. "He stayed calm and respectful the entire time," another post read. Soon, the debate wasn't just about the interview anymore. It had become part of a much larger cultural conversation. Entertainment websites began posting headlines about the exchange between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View. Commentators on television discussed the moment. Podcasters analyzed every line. Within hours, the phrase Cavill versus Hostin was trending across multiple platforms. Back inside the studio, however, the energy had softened. Some audience members approached the stage as the crew prepared for the next segment. A few people thanked the hosts for the discussion. Others complimented Henry on how he handled the questions. One woman in the front row said quietly, "That was one of the most interesting interviews I've ever seen here." Henry smiled politely. "Thank you," he said. Nearby, Sunny was speaking with one of the producers. "People are going to talk about that," the producer whispered. Sunny glanced briefly toward Henry before nodding. "I hope they do," she replied. "That's the point of conversations like this." Meanwhile, Henry gathered his jacket from the back of his chair. One of the other hosts walked over to him. "You handled that well," she said with a grin. Henry chuckled softly. "I think everyone handled it well," he replied. But as he walked backstage, he could already hear staff members discussing their phones. "Look at this," one assistant said. Another responded, "It's everywhere." Henry glanced at one of the screens. Clips from the interview were already circulating with thousands, then hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections were filling rapidly. Some people debated the meaning of privilege. Others argued about celebrity influence. And many simply praised the fact that the conversation had remained respectful despite its intensity. Later that evening, entertainment journalists began publishing full breakdowns of the moment. Some called it a rare, unscripted clash. Others described it as a surprisingly thoughtful debate. One article described it as a reminder that real dialogue is still possible on live television. Sunny, meanwhile, addressed the moment during a brief follow-up discussion later in the show. "These are the conversations people are having at home," she told viewers. "And our job is to bring those conversations into the open." Across town, Henry was preparing to leave the studio. A reporter caught him near the exit. "Henry," the reporter asked quickly, "any thoughts about the interview today?" Henry paused. He smiled politely. "I appreciate thoughtful discussions," he said simply. Then he stepped into his car. But the story didn't stop there. Over the next several days, the interview continued to spread online. Clips reached millions of views. Reaction videos appeared across YouTube. Some viewers supported Sunny's challenging questions. Others admired Henry's calm responses. And many people said something even more interesting. They said the moment showed what debate should look like: two people disagreeing without hostility. In a media environment often dominated by shouting matches and viral outrage, that alone made the conversation stand out. Weeks later, some fans still talked about it, not because it was explosive, but because it was unexpected. Two public figures from very different worlds sitting across from each other, asking difficult questions and answering them honestly. And maybe that's why the moment resonated so widely, because it reminded people that conversations, even uncomfortable ones, can still be respectful. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this intense moment between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View? Was Sunny right to push the conversation further? Or did Henry handle the situation in the best possible way? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic, cinematic stories about unforgettable moments like this, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because the next story we uncover might be even more shocking than this one.